Welcome to the Buried Ledger. Before we begin this story, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now, and in the comments, tell me where you're watching this from. What the loyal coachman did on the night of the uprising made his master beg for 17 miles. The nursing home in Charleston, South Carolina, smells of disinfectant and boiled vegetables, scents that have soaked into the walls over decades of institutional care. It is June 3rd, 1954, a Thursday afternoon, and the temperature outside has climbed to 87 degrees Fahrenheit. But inside, the air conditioning keeps the building at a steady 72. The common room, where residents gather for afternoon activities, is painted pale green, furnished with worn armchairs and a television that plays to an audience of mostly sleeping elderly people. The carpet is industrial brown, cleaned weekly but permanently stained by years of spills and shuffling feet. In the corner farthest from the television sits an ancient black man in a wheelchair, positioned so he can look out the window at the live oak trees in the courtyard. His name, according to the records kept by the nursing staff, is Thomas Jefferson Washington, age 103, admitted in 1952 when his daughter could no longer care for him at home. He is blind now, his eyes clouded with cataracts that no one will pay to remove, because what is the point of eye surgery for a man who has already lived a century? His hands rest on the arms of the wheelchair, hands that are nothing but bones covered in papery skin, liver-spotted and trembling with a palsy he cannot control. But his mind, the nurses say, is sharp as it ever was, sharper than many residents 40 years younger. Beside him sits his great-great-grandson, Marcus, aged 16, who has been brought to visit by his mother every Sunday for the past year, but who has never really talked to the old man, has just sat in uncomfortable silence. Silence while his mother made conversation, and Thomas stared out the window at things he could no longer see. But today is different. Today, Marcus has come alone, has taken 2 buses to get here, has brought a notebook and a pen. He has a school assignment: interview someone who lived through significant historical events, write a report about their experiences. His teacher suggested he talk to his ancient relative, said that someone born in 1851 would have memories of the Civil War, of Reconstruction, of the entire history of black Americans, from slavery through Jim Crow and into the modern civil rights movement. Marcus sits down in the chair next to the wheelchair. The old man does not turn his head, does not acknowledge his presence. For a long moment there is only the sound of the television playing to the sleeping audience, the hum of the air conditioning, the occasional shuffle of a nurse's feet in the hallway. Then Marcus speaks. "Mr. Washington, I mean great-great-grandfather, it's Marcus. I came to ask you some questions for school, about when you were young, about the war and everything." The old man is silent for so long that Marcus begins to think he is asleep with his eyes open, which happens sometimes, according to his mother. But then the ancient voice speaks, rough and thin, but surprisingly steady. "Thomas Jefferson Washington," the old man says, "is a name I chose in 1865 when I needed a name for freedom papers. My real name was Thomas, just Thomas. No last name, because enslaved people didn't have last names. And the thing they tell you to write about in school, the thing they want you to ask me about, is not the interesting part of the story. The interesting part is what happened on the night of August 14th, 1863, when my master jumped into the carriage and told him to drive him to safety, and I did exactly what he asked, just not the way he expected." Marcus leans forward, notebook forgotten. The old man's blind eyes stare out the window, but his mind is seeing something else entirely, something that happened 91 years ago in a different world. "Let me tell you what really happened that night," Thomas says. "Let me tell you about loyalty and betrayal and the 17 miles that changed everything. And let me tell you why even now, 103 years old and dying, I would do it all again, exactly the same way." The air conditioning hums, the television plays, and Thomas Jefferson Washington, born Thomas the Slave, begins to speak of a night when the world caught fire, and a loyal servant made a choice that looked like obedience, but was actually the most perfect revenge ever executed, with nothing but a carriage, 2 horses, and 17 miles of South Carolina road. Beaufort County, South Carolina, March 39, 1839. The Hartwell plantation sprawled across 4,200 acres of prime South Carolina low country land along the tidal marshes of the May River. The property had been in the Hartwell family since 1752, passed down through 4 generations of men who had built their wealth on rice cultivation, taking advantage of the unique geography of the low country, where tidal flooding could be controlled through an elaborate system of dikes and floodgates to irrigate rice fields. By 1839, the plantation was one of the most profitable in South Carolina, producing approximately 500,000 pounds of rice per year, sold at approximately 4 cents per pound, generating annual revenue of $20,000. Master Robert Hartwell owned the land, valued at $87,000, including improvements and equipment. He owned the rice mills, the barns, the dikes, the main house, a 2-story Georgian mansion with 12 rooms and a wraparound piazza overlooking the river. And he owned 234 human beings, valued collectively at $163,000, listed in his ledger books with the same precision he used to inventory his livestock and farm equipment. Adult males, prime age 18 to 35, $800 to $1,200. Adult females, $700 to $1,000. Children valued as future assets, prices increasing as they aged and could be put to productive work. Thomas was born in the quarters in March of 1839, delivered by an enslaved midwife named Sarah, who had brought 63 children into the world in the past 12 years, 41 of whom survived past age 5. The plantation ledger recorded Thomas's birth in Master Hartwell's neat handwriting. March 12, 1839, Negro child, male, born to Jenny, healthy. Estimated mature value $1,000. That was the only official record of Thomas's existence for the first 5 years of his life. He was an asset in development, a future return on investment, nothing more. Jenny, Thomas's mother, worked in the rice fields from age 12 to age 34 when she died of malaria, complicated by malnutrition and exhaustion. Thomas was 6 years old when she died. He remembered her in fragments, her hands calloused and cracked from constant immersion in rice field water, her voice singing softly at night when they lay on their pallet in the quarters, the way she would save part of her own inadequate food ration to give him extra because he was small and sickly, and she feared he would not survive childhood without supplemental nutrition. After Jenny died, Thomas was assigned to work in the stable. He was too small for field work, too weak for heavy labor. The stable was considered light duty, suitable for children and the elderly. The Hartwell plantation maintained 12 horses and 6 carriages of various types. The horses were valuable. Good carriage horses cost between $100 and $200 each and required skilled care. The stablemaster was an enslaved man named Jacob, 61 years old, who had been working with horses since he was 8.
Jacob had survived 53 years of bondage through a combination of genuine skill, strategic deference, and the good fortune of being too valuable to lose through abuse. "You understand what you are," Jacob told him, when Thomas was 9 years old. They were in the stable late at night, grooming the horses, after Master Hartwell had returned from a dinner party on a neighboring plantation. "You are property worth maybe $300 right now, maybe $800 if you live to adulthood and learn your trade well. But property can be sold, can be beaten, can be worked to death if the master decides the immediate profit is worth more than your future value. The only protection you have is being good at something that's hard to replace. Master Hartwell has owned horses longer than he's owned most of the people here. He cares about his horses. You make yourself necessary to his horses' welfare, and he will keep you alive because you serve his interests." Thomas learned his trade. By age 12, he could harness a team faster than anyone else in the stable. By age 15, he could drive a carriage through difficult terrain with a smoothness that made passengers comfortable. By age 18, he was the primary coachman for the Hartwell family, driving Master Hartwell to business meetings in Beaufort, driving Mrs. Hartwell to social visits with neighboring plantation wives, driving the Hartwell children to school and church. He worked 7 days a week, rising at 5 o'clock in the morning to feed and groom the horses, working until 8 or 9 at night when the last carriage returned and needed to be cleaned and the horses stabled. His value in the plantation ledger had increased to $1,200 by 1857, making him one of the most expensive enslaved people on the plantation.
Master Robert Hartwell was 51 years old in 1857. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 215 pounds, most of it carried in his belly and jowls. He had thinning brown hair combed over a balding pate, side whiskers in the style popular among Southern gentlemen, and small gray eyes that showed no particular cruelty, but also no particular kindness. He was not an especially brutal master by the standards of his time and place. He did not inflict punishments for entertainment. He did not sexually abuse enslaved women as many planters did. He ran his plantation with the efficiency of a businessman managing a factory, calculating costs and benefits, maximizing profit through careful resource allocation rather than through terror. But efficiency required discipline. The Hartwell plantation employed 2 white overseers who maintained order through a schedule of punishments calibrated to deter infractions while minimizing damage to valuable property. Whipping for significant violations, 15 lashes for being late to work, 25 for speaking disrespectfully to whites, 50 for attempting to run away. Lesser punishments for minor violations, reduced rations, assignment to harder work, public humiliation. The punishments were documented in the overseer's logbooks with the same precision Hartwell used for all plantation records. The system was designed not for cruelty, but for control, and it functioned efficiently. Thomas appeared in those punishment logs only 3 times in 18 years, once at age 10 for accidentally damaging a carriage wheel through improper maintenance, punished with 3 days of reduced rations, once at age 14 for being late to harness the horses for Master Hartwell's morning departure, punished with 5 lashes, once at age 16 for allowing one of the horses to develop a saddle sore that went unnoticed for 2 days, punished with 10 lashes and a week of additional evening work. He learned from each punishment. He became more careful, more attentive, more perfectly obedient. He developed the particular skill of anticipating what his masters wanted before they asked for it, of being present but invisible, of performing his duty so smoothly that they could pretend he was not a person, but simply a function that happened automatically when they required it.
Master Hartwell came to trust Thomas completely. Trust in this context meant confidence that Thomas would perform his duties reliably and would not cause problems. It did not mean affection or respect or any acknowledgement of Thomas as fully human. But it meant that when Master Hartwell needed to travel, he called for Thomas without even thinking about it. It meant that Thomas had access to information that most enslaved people never obtained. He heard conversations in the carriage, learned about Hartwell's business affairs, his debts, his affairs, his fears. He heard Hartwell and his friends discuss politics, secession, the possibility of war. He heard things that could be useful if anyone had asked him, but no one ever asked, because asking a slave for information would have required acknowledging that the slave was intelligent enough to understand and remember what he heard. By 1860, Thomas had been driving Master Hartwell for 7 years. He knew every road within 30 miles of the plantation. He knew the locations of neighboring plantations, the towns, the rivers and ferries. He knew which routes had steep grades where the horses would labor, which had soft sand where wheels could bog down, which had bridges that were weak and needed careful crossing. He knew because precision mattered, because getting Master Hartwell to his destination safely and on time was his function, and performing that function flawlessly was what kept him valuable and therefore relatively safe. What Thomas did not know, because he had never been taught and had no way to learn, was that loyalty based on fear and strategic calculation is not the same as loyalty based on genuine bond. He performed perfect obedience, but inside him, carefully hidden, was a consciousness that observed and remembered and waited. The consciousness of someone who had been property for 21 years and who had never once forgotten that being property was wrong, was a violation, was a daily theft of his humanity that could not be undone by kind treatment or by his own strategic compliance with the system that enslaved him. April 12, 1861. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor came under Confederate artillery fire at 4:30 in the morning. The Civil War had begun. Thomas learned about it 2 days later when Master Hartwell returned from Beaufort with newspapers and told his wife that President Lincoln was calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion and that South Carolina was now officially at war with the United States. Mrs. Hartwell cried. Master Hartwell looked grim but determined. Their eldest son, Robert Jr., aged 23, he immediately volunteered for a cavalry unit forming in Beaufort. He left for training in May and was killed at the First Battle of Bull Run in July, shot through the chest while charging Union positions. The war years changed the plantation. White men left to fight. Production declined because there were not enough overseers to maintain the previous level of control. Food became scarce as the Union blockade cut off imports and the Confederate Army requisitioned supplies. By 1863, the Hartwell plantation was operating maybe 60% of its pre-war capacity.
The enslaved population, which had been 234 in 1839, was down to 191, reduced by death from disease and malnutrition, by flight when Union forces began operating in the Low Country, by sale when Hartwell needed cash to pay debts. Thomas continued his work with the horses and carriages. His duties actually increased during the war because Master Hartwell needed to travel more frequently to Beaufort for meetings with other planters, to Charleston for business that could not be conducted by correspondence. The roads became more dangerous. Confederate deserters roamed the countryside. Union raiding parties occasionally penetrated inland from the coastal islands they had occupied. Travel required alertness and quick decision-making. Thomas drove carefully, carried a pistol for Master Hartwell's protection, got them where they needed to go and back safely. In July 1862,
Union forces occupied Port Royal and the Sea Islands south of Beaufort. Thousands of enslaved people fled to Union lines, seeking the freedom that federal occupation promised. The Hartwell plantation lost 37 people over 3 months. They walked away at night, heading south toward Port Royal, risking death by Confederate patrols and by the swamps and rivers they had to cross. Some made it. Some were caught and returned to their masters for brutal punishment as warnings to others. Some simply disappeared into the night and were never heard from again. Master Hartwell tightened security. He armed white men who were too old or too essential to be drafted. He posted guards at night. He reduced rations to make flight less attractive because who would run away into starvation? He preached sermons about loyalty and the natural order of things, and how the Yankees were lying about freedom, how enslaved people were actually better off under their master's protection than they would be trying to survive on their own. Most of the remaining enslaved people stayed, not because they believed these lies, but because flight was genuinely dangerous and the chances of survival uncertain. Thomas stayed because he had no family to protect during flight, because he was valuable enough that Hartwell watched him closely, and because he had access to information that made him calculate that waiting might be safer than running. He heard conversations about Union troop movements. He heard that Sherman was advancing through Georgia. He heard whispers that the war was not going well for the Confederacy. And he heard fear in Master Hartwell's voice when he talked to other planters, a fear that everything was about to collapse. August 14th, 1863. The day was already hot at 7 in the morning, the temperature climbing toward 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas had risen at 5, as always, had fed and groomed the horses, and cleaned the carriage Master Hartwell would need that afternoon for a trip to Beaufort. Master Hartwell was meeting with other planters to discuss their response to rumors that Union forces were planning a major offensive in the Low Country. Thomas prepared the carriage with his usual precision, checked the wheels, tested the traces, made sure water buckets were filled for the horses. Everything had to be perfect, because imperfection meant punishment, and Thomas had not been punished in 7 years because he never made mistakes. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Thomas heard shouting from the direction of the rice fields, unusual. Workdays were usually quiet except for the overseer's commands and the rhythmic sounds of labor, but this was different. Multiple voices, overlapping, urgent, then a gunshot, then another, then screaming. Thomas stood in the stable and watched enslaved people running toward the main house, not running away, running toward. He saw men carrying tools that were not for farming, hoes raised like weapons, pitchforks held like spears. He saw an overseer named Morrison running from the fields, saw him stumble, saw 3 men catch him and pull him down. Morrison did not get up. More gunfire from different directions. The other overseer, Price, was shooting from behind a shed. Thomas saw field hands scatter, then regroup, then advance. Price ran out of ammunition. The field hands caught him. This was an uprising was happening, now in broad daylight on the Hartwell plantation. Thomas had heard stories of such things, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey. He knew they always ended with massacres of everyone involved, with reprisals that killed far more people than the original uprising. He knew that anyone present during an uprising, whether they participated or not, would be suspected and likely killed. The smart thing was to disappear, to run into the swamps and hide until it was over. But before Thomas could move, Master Hartwell came bursting out of the main house, hatless, vest unbuttoned, face red with exertion and fear. He saw Thomas in the stable yard and ran toward him. "Thomas, harness the team now. We have to leave immediately." Thomas had been trained for 24 years to respond instantly to commands. His body moved before his mind processed what was happening. He went into the stable, brought out the 2 carriage horses, began harnessing them with the automatic efficiency of 10,000 repetitions. His hands knew the work without conscious thought. Collar over the head, adjust the fit, buckle the hams, attach the traces to the singletree, check the bits and reins. 2 minutes. He had done this so many thousands of times that 2 minutes was enough for a complete harness job that would have taken a less experienced person 10. Master Hartwell was at the carriage, throwing a bag into the interior. He saw it was heavy, heard the clink of metal, money or valuables probably. Hartwell looked back at the main house. Mrs. Hartwell was visible in the doorway, white dress, hands pressed to her mouth. The field hands were getting closer, had seen Hartwell, were coming toward the stable yard. "Thomas, move! Get us out of here!" Thomas climbed onto the driver's seat. The reins felt familiar in his hands, leather worn smooth by years of use. Master Hartwell scrambled into the carriage, slammed the door. Thomas saw field hands running across the lawn, maybe 200 yards away. He saw more people emerging from the quarters. He saw the main house had smoke coming from a first-floor window. Everything was chaos. Thomas released the brake, flicked the reins. The horses moved forward from walk to trot. The carriage rolled out of the stable yard onto the drive. Behind them, someone threw something at the carriage, a rock that hit the back panel with a dull thud, but did no damage. More shouting. Thomas heard a gunshot, but the bullet did not hit anything near them. He urged the horses to faster trot, then to canter. The carriage bounced over the rough drive, wheels clattering on packed earth. They reached the main road and turned east toward Beaufort, 23 miles away. Master Hartwell leaned out the window. "Faster, Thomas! Get us to Beaufort! I'll pay you $100 when we arrive. Just get us there safely." $100.
Thomas had never held $100 in his life. Enslaved people did not receive wages. $100 would have been meaningless even if the promise were genuine, which Thomas knew it was not, because slaves could not own property, and Master Hartwell would not actually pay him anything because masters did not pay slaves for doing their duty. But that was irrelevant because Thomas had already decided where they were going, and it was not Beaufort. He drove the carriage east for approximately 1 mile, putting distance between them and the plantation. The horses were in full canter now, the carriage swaying on its suspension, wheels hitting ruts and bouncing. Master Hartwell had pulled his head back inside, was holding on to the door strap, probably terrified they would overturn at this speed. Thomas knew they would not overturn because he knew these horses, knew this carriage, knew exactly how fast he could push them on this road. After 1 mile, Thomas saw the intersection ahead where the Beaufort Road continued east but a smaller road branched south. South toward Port Royal, south toward Union lines, south toward freedom. Thomas had known this intersection existed, had driven past it hundreds of times, had never taken the South Fork because he had never been ordered to take it, and taking roads without orders would have been suspicious, would have invited questions about why a slave was curious about routes leading toward Union territory. Thomas turned south. He felt Master Hartwell shift in the carriage, felt the change in weight distribution as Hartwell moved to look out the window. A pause, then Hartwell's voice, confused. "Thomas, this isn't the Beaufort Road. You've taken the wrong turn." Thomas said nothing. He kept the horses a canter. The South Road was worse than the main road, more ruts, some washed-out sections where recent rains had eroded the surface. He had to slow slightly, but kept them moving at a pace that would be hard for anyone on foot to match. "Thomas, I said you've taken the wrong turn. Stop the carriage. We need to go back." Thomas did not stop, did not turn around, did not respond. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, hands steady on the reins. Behind them, the smoke from the burning Hartwell plantation would be visible for miles. Ahead, maybe 15 miles, were Union lines and the possibility of something he had never experienced in 24 years of life. Freedom.
Master Hartwell's voice changed, less commanding, more uncertain. "Thomas, stop the carriage right now. That's an order." An order. Thomas had been following orders every day of his conscious life. Get up, work, do this, do that, obey or be punished. The entire architecture of his existence was built on responding to orders. But something had changed in the past 15 minutes. The plantation was burning. The system that had created orders and enforced them through violence was collapsing. Master Hartwell, sitting in the carriage giving orders, was no longer backed by overseers, by slave catchers, by courts and laws, and the entire structure of Southern society. He was just a man trapped in a box on wheels, dependent entirely on the skills of the person he had treated as property. Thomas drove south. The road passed through pine forest, flat, low country terrain, sandy soil with standing water in the low places. The afternoon heat was oppressive. The horses were sweating heavily. Thomas would need to walk them soon to cool them down, but not yet. He needed distance. He drove for another mile, maybe 2. The carriage bounced over a particularly deep rut. He heard something heavy shift in the interior, heard Master Hartwell curse. Then Master Hartwell tried a different approach. His voice came through the window, more reasonable now, almost conversational. "Thomas, I understand you're confused. With everything happening back there, the chaos, you're not thinking clearly. But we need to get to Beaufort, where there's safety. The Confederate Army is in Beaufort. We'll be protected there. If you take me to Union lines, they'll arrest you. Yankees don't treat colored people the way you've been treated by us. They'll put you to hard labor, might even kill you. You're safer with me. Now stop this carriage and turn around." It was a lie. Thomas had heard enough conversations to know it was a lie. Union forces were actively recruiting black soldiers. Frederick Douglass had been arguing for it in newspapers that Thomas had seen on the rare occasions Master Hartwell left one lying around. The Union was not perfect, but it was not slavery. It was possibility. Thomas drove south. The road began to descend slightly toward the coastal marshlands. Thomas could smell salt water in the air. They were getting closer to the coast, closer to the areas Union forces controlled. The horses were tiring. He would need to rest them soon. He saw a widening in the road ahead, a place where he could pull over without getting stuck in the soft sand at the road's edge. Master Hartwell tried anger. "Thomas, you goddamn cunt, stop this carriage or I swear to Christ I will have you hanged. Do you understand me? Hanged. You think you're doing something clever, but you're just making it worse for yourself. Every mile you take me is another charge against you. Stop now." The words echoed inside the carriage and out the windows into the afternoon air. Thomas heard them. He had heard words like that before. Threats, curses, the casual violence of language that masters used to remind enslaved people of their place. But the words felt different now, hollow. Master Hartwell could threaten hanging, but he had no rope, could threaten punishment, but had no overseers to carry it out, could threaten anything, but the threats were just sounds, air vibrating, signifying nothing. Thomas began to slow the horses, not stopping, just reducing from canter to trot, from trot to walk. He needed to rest them, needed to check their condition, needed to water them if possible. He saw a small creek running beside the road ahead, one of the many small streams that crisscrossed the low country. He guided the horses to stop near the creek, set the brake, wrapped the reins. He heard the carriage door open. Master Hartwell stepped out, stumbling slightly because the carriage had stopped on uneven ground. He was red-faced, sweating, his expensive coat rumpled. He looked at Thomas on the driver's seat, and for the first time in 24 years, Thomas looked back at him directly, not with the downcast eyes of a slave, but with level gaze of a man assessing another man. "Get down from there," Hartwell said. His voice was trying for authority, but Thomas could hear the uncertainty underneath. "Get down right now. We're walking back to the main road."
"We're going to Beaufort like I told you to." Thomas did not move. He sat on the driver's seat and looked at the man who had owned him and said quietly, "No." That single word changed the air between them. It was the first time in 24 years that Thomas had refused a direct order. The first time he had openly defied the man who had owned his body and his labor and had believed he owned his will. The word hung between them like smoke. Hartwell's face went through several expressions: shock, confusion, rage. He stepped toward the carriage wheel as if he might climb up to the driver's seat and physically take the reins. But he was 53 years old, overweight, not athletic. Thomas was 24, in excellent physical condition from years of labor. The physical disparity was suddenly obvious in a way it had never been when social structures enforced Hartwell's dominance. "I could beat you," Hartwell said, but his voice wavered. "I could take those reins from you." "You could try," Thomas said, "but you won't succeed. And even if you did, you don't know how to drive a team. You don't know these roads. You don't know how to care for horses. Without me, you'll die out here, either from exposure or from Confederate deserters who will kill you for whatever money you're carrying. With me, you get to Union lines alive, but we're going my direction, not yours." Hartwell stared at him. Thomas could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The man who had owned him was trying to adjust to a situation where the power dynamics had inverted completely. "You're taking me prisoner. I'm taking you where I'm going. You can get out and walk back if you want. I won't stop you." Hartwell looked back down the road they had come, several miles to the intersection, more miles to the plantation, which was probably still burning. No food, no water, no horse. He looked at the forest on either side of the road, thick pine woods where he would get lost in minutes. He looked at Thomas, who sat calmly on the driver's seat, holding the reins, completely in control of the only transportation available. "You won't get away with this," Hartwell said, but his voice had lost all conviction. "Maybe not," Thomas said, "but I'm free anyway, right now. For however long this lasts, you could send 1,000 men after me tomorrow, and that wouldn't change the fact that right now, on this road, I'm deciding where we go. That's worth whatever happens next." He climbed down from the driver's seat, went to check the horses. They had cooled enough to drink. He led them to the creek, let them drink for exactly 2 minutes, long enough to satisfy thirst, not long enough to founder. He checked their hooves, looking for stones or damage. He ran his hands over their legs, checking for heat or swelling that might indicate injury. The horses were fine. He had driven them hard, but not beyond their capability. Master Hartwell stood beside the carriage, watching this careful maintenance with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Finally, Hartwell spoke. "You really love those horses, don't you?" Thomas looked up, surprised by the question. "I take care of them. That's my job." "It's more than that. I've watched you with them for years. You care about them. You're gentle with them. You notice when they're uncomfortable or tired. You treat them better than you—" Stopped. "Better than you treat people," Thomas finished. "Yes, I do. Because horses don't pretend you're their property. They don't lie about owning you. They're just horses. And if you're kind to them, they'll work with you. That's honest. What you did, what all of you did, that was never honest. You called it natural order, called it God's will, called it anything except what it was, theft. You stole my life, my labor, my choices. The horses never stole anything." Hartwell was quiet. "Then I never thought of it that way." "You never had to," Thomas said. He led the horses back to the carriage, began rehitching them. "You benefited from not thinking about it, but I thought about it every day for 24 years. Every single day I thought about how this was wrong, how I was a person being treated as property, how everything you built was built on theft. I couldn't say it, couldn't even show I was thinking it, but I thought it. We all thought it.
Every single person you owned knew exactly what was being done to them. He finished hitching the horses, climbed back onto the driver's seat. He looked down at Hartwell. "Get in the carriage or don't. We're leaving in 30 seconds." Hartwell got in. He had no choice. Thomas released the brake and drove south. They traveled for another hour, making perhaps 5 miles. The road deteriorated as they got closer to the coastal marshes. Several times Thomas had to stop and examine the road ahead, determining if the surface would support the carriageway or if they needed to find another route. Master Hartwell sat in the carriage and said nothing. Thomas could feel the man's eyes on him, but he ignored it, focused on the work of getting them safely to wherever they were going. The sun was lowering toward the horizon when Thomas saw smoke ahead, but different from the plantation smoke. This was cook fire smoke, multiple sources, the kind that came from a military encampment. He drove more slowly, alert for sentries. In the distance, he could see tents, Union Army tents arranged in rows, a picket line of horses, men in blue uniforms. Master Hartwell saw it too. His voice came from the carriage. "Thomas, please don't do this. I have money. I can pay you. I can give you papers of manumission. I can—" Thomas stopped the carriage. He set the brake, wrapped the reins carefully. He climbed down and opened the carriage door. Master Hartwell sat inside, his face showing something Thomas had never seen before: fear. Not anger, not authority trying to reassert itself, just pure fear of a man facing consequences he never believed arrived.
"I don't want your money," Thomas said. "I don't want papers from you because you never had the right to own me in the first place. Papers saying you're graciously freeing me would be lies built on top of lies. I want you to understand something, not agree with it, just understand it. Everything you had, everything you were, was built on stealing from people like me. You stole my childhood. You stole my mother's life. You stole 24 years I can never get back. And now I'm taking one thing from you. I'm taking away your certainty that this would always work, that we would always obey, that you could always depend on us to help you, even when you were running from the consequences of what you did to us." He stepped back from the carriage. "Union soldiers are going to find us in about 10 minutes when they send out scouts to see who's coming down this road. They'll take you prisoner. They'll probably put you in a camp. After the war, if you survive it, you'll go home to whatever's left of your plantation, and you'll have to figure out how to live without owning people. And maybe you'll remember this conversation and understand that every single person you owned was a person, not property. That we had thoughts and feelings and dreams just like you did. That we hated what was done to us, and that the fact we couldn't stop you didn't mean you were right." Thomas turned to unhitch the horses. Master Hartwell climbed out of the carriage. He stood there in the late afternoon sun, a 53-year-old man who had just lost everything, watching the slave who had driven him to his own capture, methodically caring for the horses who had carried them both to this moment. "What will you do?" Hartwell asked. "Join the Union Army, probably," Thomas said. "They're recruiting colored soldiers. I can drive supply wagons, maybe fight if they'll let me. After the war," he paused, thinking about a future he had never been allowed to imagine before. "I don't know. Something, anything. It'll be mine. Whatever it is, my choice, my labor, my life." He finished unhitching the horses, led them away from the carriage. Behind him he heard Master Hartwell say quietly, "I'm sorry." Thomas stopped, turned, looked at the man. "Are you? Are you sorry you owned slaves, or are you sorry you got caught? Are you sorry for what you did, or just sorry it ended badly for you?" Hartwell opened his mouth, closed it. He had no answer. "That's what I thought," Thomas said. He led the horses toward the Union camp.
Behind him, Master Hartwell stood beside the empty carriage on a road in South Carolina and faced whatever came next, which would not be pleasant, which would not be comfortable, which would be a tiny fraction of what he had inflicted on others for 30 years, but which would at least be something. Union soldiers arrived within minutes, saw the carriage, saw Hartwell, took him into custody. They questioned Thomas, who explained what had happened, the uprising, the flight, the decision to come to Union lines instead of Beaufort. The soldiers seemed unsure what to make of this story, but they accepted it. They gave Thomas food, the first meal he had chosen to eat in 24 years, rather than being given at someone else's decision. They assigned him to work with the quartermaster's corps, driving supply wagons. Within a week, he had enlisted formally in the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, which later became the 33rd United States Colored Infantry. Thomas Jefferson Washington, as he called himself in his enlistment papers, served until the end of the war in 1865. He fought at Honey Hill, at Tulifinny Creek, at other engagements whose names he would later struggle to remember. He survived the war, which many did not. He was wounded twice, neither seriously. He was present when Charleston fell to Union forces in February 1865, marched into the city with his regiment, and thought about Master Hartwell, who believed Charleston would never fall, who believed the Confederacy would win, who believed the world he knew would continue forever. After the war, Thomas settled in Charleston. He worked as a teamster, driving freight wagons, using the skills he had developed as an enslaved coachman, but now receiving wages for his labor. He married in 1867 a woman named Sarah, who had been enslaved on a different plantation and who had her own stories of survival and loss. They had 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. He lived through Reconstruction, through the collapse of Reconstruction, through the rise of Jim Crow. He saw promise followed by betrayal, saw brief hope for genuine equality crushed by white supremacy, reasserting itself through law and violence. He lived through it all, worked hard, raised his family, and told almost no one the story of August 14th, 1863. Because stories of slaves defying masters were dangerous even after slavery ended. It could mark you as rebellious, could bring attention from people who wanted to remind black folks that they should be grateful and obedient even in freedom. In the nursing home in Charleston in 1954, old Thomas finishes his story. The afternoon has faded toward evening. The television still plays to its sleeping audience. Marcus sits stunned, his notebook still blank because he forgot to write anything, too absorbed in listening. "What happened to Master Hartwell?" Marcus finally asks. "He survived the war," Thomas says, "was released from prison camp in 1865, went back to what was left of his plantation, tried to farm it using hired black labor, but it didn't work, sold the land in pieces, died in 1872, broke and bitter. His wife had died during the war, his remaining sons scattered to other states. The Hartwell name disappeared. There's probably descendants somewhere, but they don't know their history, don't know they come from slave owners who lost everything when slavery ended. Do you feel bad about what you did, taking him prisoner?" Thomas is quiet for a long moment. "I feel bad about what happened to his wife. She probably died because I took the only escape route available. The field hands would have been angry, might have taken it out on her. I think about that sometimes. She wasn't kind to enslaved people, but she wasn't especially cruel either, just indifferent, just part of a system she never questioned. But him, Master Hartwell, no, I don't feel bad about him. He had 30 years to think about what he was doing and chose not to. He could have freed his slaves at any time. Some planters did. He didn't. He kept us because it profited him. So when the moment came to choose between his safety and my freedom, I chose my freedom. That's the only choice I regret not making sooner. "What do you want me to write about?" Marcus asks, "for my school report." Thomas turns his blind eyes toward the sound of Marcus's voice. "Tell them this. Loyalty that's forced isn't loyalty. It's just obedience maintained by threat of violence. Real loyalty requires choice, requires mutual respect, requires seeing each other as equally human. Master Hartwell thought I was loyal because I did what he ordered for 24 years, but I wasn't loyal. I was enslaved. There's a difference. And when the situation changed, when his power to compel me disappeared, so did my loyalty. It was always fake. He just never realized it because he never had to." He pauses. "Tell them that the 17 miles between the Hartwell plantation and Union lines were the first 17 miles of my life that I chose for myself. Master Hartwell begged me to stop, offered me money, threatened me with hanging, tried everything he could think of, and I just kept driving south because for the first time in my life I could. That's what freedom means. Not comfort, not safety, not even justice, just choice. The ability to decide for yourself what you're going to do. Even if the consequences are terrible, even if you're scared, even if you don't know what happens next. I had that for 17 miles, and it was worth everything that came after." Marcus writes this down carefully in his notebook. Then he asks one more question. "Do you think things have gotten better since then, since 1863? Thomas considers this. Outside the window, the South Carolina afternoon light falls through the live oaks. Somewhere in the distance, a radio plays. The world has changed enormously in 91 years. Slavery has been abolished. Black people are citizens, at least legally. But Marcus has come to visit on a bus that black people had to sit at the back of. He attends a segregated school. The Supreme Court just ruled on Brown versus Board of Education, declaring segregation unconstitutional. But Charleston has not yet integrated its schools and won't for years. "Better than slavery," Thomas says. "Anything is better than slavery. But it's not good, not yet, not equal. The war ended slavery, but it didn't end white supremacy. That's still here, just wearing different clothes, using laws instead of chains. You're living in Jim Crow, which is its own kind of prison, its own kind of theft. Not as bad as what I experienced, but still wrong, still a system designed to keep you less than fully human in the eyes of people who benefit from your oppression." He reaches out his hand, finds Marcus's arm, grips it with surprising strength. "You want to know what to do about it? Same thing I did on that August day in 1863. When you see the choice between obedience to an unjust system and freedom, choose freedom. Even if it's dangerous, even if you don't know what comes next, even if people threaten you and call you uppity and tell you to know your place, choose freedom. Drive that carriage toward Union lines and don't look back."
And maybe your children or your grandchildren will live in the world that should have been built after slavery ended but wasn't. Maybe they'll get to just be human without having to fight for it. That would be worth it. That would make those 17 miles mean something. The nursing home grows quiet. Dinner is being served in the dining hall. Nurses are moving through the corridors. The television has moved on to the evening news. Marcus closes his notebook.
He has enough for his report, enough for 1,000 reports. He has a story that should be taught in every school, but won't be. A story about how slavery ended not just because of battles and generals and presidents, but because people like Thomas made individual choices, took individual risks, drove carriages south when they were ordered to drive east. "Thank you," Marcus says, "for telling me." "You're welcome," Thomas says. "Now go write your report. Tell the truth. They probably won't believe you, because the truth about slavery is harder and more complicated than what they teach in schools. But tell it anyway. Someone needs to." Marcus leaves. Thomas Jefferson Washington, born Thomas the Slave, age 103, sits in his wheelchair and looks out the window at the live oaks and thinks about horses he cared for 91 years ago, about a road through South Carolina pine forests, about 17 miles that took 4 hours to travel but changed everything. He is blind now, dying at the end of a long life that contained more sorrow than joy. But he has those 17 miles. No one can take them from him. They are his completely and forever, the first act of true freedom he ever chose, and they were worth everything. Thomas Jefferson Washington died 3 months later, on September 8, 1954. His obituary in the Charleston newspaper mentioned that he was a veteran of the Civil War, one of the last surviving members of the 33rd United States Colored Infantry. It did not mention the uprising at the Hartwell plantation, or the carriage ride to Union lines, or the choice he made to drive south instead of east. Those stories lived on only in the memories of his descendants, passed down through generations, whispered rather than shouted, because even in freedom some truths remain dangerous. But Marcus wrote his report. He told the story as Thomas had told him to him. He got a B grade because the teacher thought parts of it seemed exaggerated, thought a slave would not have dared to defy his master so directly, thought the story was embellished for dramatic effect. But Marcus knew it was true, because he had heard it from the man who lived it. And later, when Marcus had his own children and grandchildren, he would tell them about Thomas, about the carriage ride, about the 17 miles to freedom. The story would survive, imperfectly remembered, details lost and altered by time, but the essential truth preserved, that enslaved people resisted in ways large and small, that loyalty forced by violence is not loyalty at all, and that sometimes the most profound acts of defiance look like perfect obedience right up until the moment they don't. The 17 miles between the Hartwell plantation and Union lines have long since been paved over, divided by development, changed beyond recognition. The plantation itself is gone, its fields now suburbs, its history marked only by a historical marker that mentions the Hartwell family, but says nothing about the 234 people they enslaved. But somewhere in the record of that place, in the memory of the land itself, if land could remember, there are those 17 miles, and a carriage driving south when it should have gone east, and a choice made by a man who had been denied choices his entire life, but who seized one when it was offered, and held on to it no matter the cost. That choice reverberates through time. It reaches forward to Marcus writing his report in 1954, to his children and grandchildren living in a world where slavery is history, but its echoes remain. It reaches forward to every moment when someone faces the choice between obedience to injustice and resistance to it. The choice Thomas made was not unique. Thousands of enslaved people made similar choices during those years, some successful, many not. But each choice mattered. Each act of defiance, large or small, visible or hidden, contributed to the eventual collapse of a system that depended on perfect compliance. This is not a story with a happy ending. Thomas lived to be 103, but most of his years were hard. Master Hartwell lost everything, but died comfortably enough compared to the people he had enslaved. The system of slavery ended, but was replaced by other systems of oppression. Justice was never fully achieved. But that is not the point. The point is the 17 miles. The point is the moment when a man who had been property became a person who chose. The point is that perfect obedience maintained by violence will always contain within it the possibility of perfect defiance when the violence can no longer be applied. The point is that masters who depend on slaves' loyalty without earning it through mutual respect will discover, usually too late, that they never had loyalty at all. And the point is that freedom, even briefly held, even imperfectly achieved, even if it leads to harder times than comfortable slavery ever was, is still worth choosing every single time, without exception. That is what Thomas learned on August 14, 1863, driving a carriage south through South Carolina pine forests with a terrified master begging him to stop. That is what Marcus learned in a nursing home in 1954, listening to a story that textbooks would never tell. That is what we learn if we are willing to listen from the people who lived through moments when history pivoted on individual choices made by people who were told they had no right to choose anything. The carriage is long gone, rotted away or broken up for scrap. The horses are dead, as are all their descendants. The road has been paved and widened and renamed, but the choice remains, preserved in story, passed down through generations, a testimony to what one person did when given the chance. That testimony is what Thomas wanted Marcus to write down, to remember, to tell others. Not because it changes history, the past is fixed and cannot be altered, but because it changes how we understand history, how we see the people who were enslaved, how we recognize that they were never just victims, but also actors, resistors, people who made choices when they could, and who survived when choice was denied. This is the story of 17 miles. It is not the whole story of slavery, or of freedom, or of anything, but it is one story, true enough in its essentials, important enough to preserve. And perhaps that is enough.